Hey friends, welcome to the Determinetruth Podcast, where we equip the church to be the church. Hey everyone, welcome in. We are continuing going through the Pastoral epistles, which, as I've been studying this week, it's interesting how so many scholars are actually, there's like this push to say, don't call them the Pastoral epistles. Have you encountered this, Rob?
No.
Where they're saying, while there is a connection to these, they weren't meant to be recorded, or they weren't meant to be put together. Paul didn't write them as a trio,
Sure.
but we put them as a trio, but they were, by calling them pastoral epistles, it makes it seem like they were supposed to be like this trilogy of writings when they weren't. They still had specific contexts and specific situations. So we overly assign them something when we call them. It was just interesting in studying this week that terminology. So, but we're still going to call them that because that's the way we branded this. But we had an interesting conversation last week. We introduced the topic of women in ministry, which I guess this topic does go maybe to some camps in terms of women in ministry, but we really should be more reframing the conversation on women in leadership, church leadership, right? Because that's what this is more of engaging with. There are some people who would just say women can't do anything, but that's probably an extreme view, even in a strong complementarian world. It still has to do more with women in church leadership and what they're allowed to do.
Yeah, let's define those terms really quickly, by the way, because
Okay.
we used them a couple of times last week, and I know we didn't define them. And we've done some episodes in the past.
Oh,
So
you mean
if the
complementarian egalitarianism?
Yeah. So if the listeners want to go back to some earlier episodes, like one of our very first episodes with after Vinnie, AV, was with Mimi Haddad, I think.
Yes.
And we discussed it. So complementarian would be the idea that women. Well, how do you define it, by the way? Because you like, I think you have a better way of saying it than I do. Complementarian.
Okay. A complementarian, depending on the complementarian you speak with, but it's going to be something like this, and there's a spectrum there. Complementarianism would teach that men and women are both created equally ontologically in terms of like who they are in the image of God. They both contain equal inherent self-worth as people. However, God has made them different in terms of the roles that they would serve in, and these roles are to complement one another. They're not meant to be doing the same things when it comes to, and this is where the spectrum comes into play. When it comes to church leadership, a complementarian would say there's different roles that would be held for men than there would be for women, but it has nothing to do with inferiority.
Roles that men can't. It's exactly. All right. So male headship is ultimately like two words to say male headship, which can be defined, but within the church, men can be pastors, women cannot be. Although the spectrum would say, well, women can be pastors of women. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
They can be pastors of women, or they can be pastors of children, or they can't be pastors at all. Obviously the conversation with Summer was excellent last week. So
or a lot of times what happens is you put a woman in the role of a pastor, like functionally she's doing pastor stuff, but we don't call her that. And so it's like when Summer and I served together, I mean, and I actually wasn't technically a pastor on staff. Both her and I were doing the exact same types of things in terms of what we oversaw. Her and I taught, outside of the senior pastor, Summer and I probably taught the most in that church in terms of functionally each week, than even more so than many of the pastors. But we were not given the title of pastors for various reasons. Hers having to do with gender. Even though she's doing pastoral things outside of, she wouldn't be allowed to marry, bury, preach, or baptize. And same thing with me. Those are roles I was not allowed to do.
An egalitarian is basically the idea that male and female are equal, at least in the New Covenant, which we'll address more probably next week. But within the New Covenant, male and female are equal in authority and responsibility and roles, at least opportunity-wise, within the local church.
So, and there's a spectrum on this in terms of where people land. I know egalitarians who would say I'm egalitarian, except for I would only affirm a male, like senior pastor role. It's interesting. I'm saying there's a spectrum.
There's always a spectrum.
There's a spectrum of
and by the way, just because the church is egalitarian doesn't mean that they're actually in practice equal male and female.
Sure. We talked about that a little last week. We just say it
but we don't actually practice that way. At the end of the day, men are mansplaining over the women, and men are taking the same problems are there. So, okay, let's go. Sure. Very good.
All right. So when we're looking at this topic of women in ministry, or specifically women in leadership, because that's ultimately where we're talking to. Even in a complementarian church, they would say no, women should be in ministry. They can be in ministry. They, this is the ways we're having them lead and whatnot. But there's going to be definitely a glass ceiling, or not even a glass ceiling. There's going to be a ceiling in terms of what they could do. One of the things that we want to do is we want to provide some context. We've already talked about how, while First Timothy and the pastorals definitely talk about church leadership, and it's an appropriate place to go to discuss leadership issues, it isn't a systematic theology. It isn't the only place that we would go to. And we do need to recognize it's an occasional document. It is addressing specific issues, as does every letter that Paul writes, and we can't ignore that.
Yeah. Yeah, and simply put, right now, Paul is addressing some issues of false teaching within the community in Ephesus, and in the city of Ephesus. In 1 Timothy 1, verse 3, I'll go ahead and go to the scripture for just a second. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3, Paul says, I urge you upon my departure from Macedonia to remain on at Ephesus. And then in Ephesus, apparently, there were some people that were just making all these assertions. I think in verse 4, don't be careful about certain men, verse 3, tell them not to teach strange doctrines or pay attention to myths and its genealogies. And it kind of goes on here all the way through verse 7. They want to be teachers, verse 7, but they don't understand what they're saying or the matters about which they're making confident assertions. And then he goes on later on in the passage in verse 19, verse 18 through 20, by the way, keep the faith, by the way, which some have rejected. In verse 18, they suffered shipwreck in regard to their faith, among whom are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I've handed over to Satan so they'll be taught not to blaspheme. Oh, that's kind of interesting. And then we have more in chapter 4, I think, indication, and it's very difficult. The Spirit explicitly, this chapter 4, the Spirit explicitly says that in the latter times, some will fall away from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons, by means of hypocrisy, of liars, seared in their own conscience as with a branding iron. They forbid marriage and advocate abstaining from foods, and which God created to be gratefully shared in by those who believe and know the truth. So they're teaching some kind of false doctrines, false teachings, and it's hard to discern exactly what it is based on what Paul says. You're aware, Vinnie, that in the older days, 30 years ago or more, we would say, oh, it's some kind of proto-Gnosticism, but now we know, we won't get into that. That probably wasn't around at the time that Paul was writing this letter. So some people will put these letters late because of that. The reality is there's some kind of false teaching and some kind of heretical teaching that Paul's addressing in these letters. And so that's the occasion. That's going to be really important for chapter 2 as we get into it.
Yeah. One of the major background issues for First Timothy is understanding Ephesus. And you cannot understand Ephesus without discussing the Artemis cult. Because this was, you can't not say Ephesus and not in some way connected to Artemis. And I've even thought over the years, what is an equivalent thing that we have in American society which goes together like this? And I don't know if there is one. Like what is as connected to American society as Artemis was to Ephesus?
Yeah, there's not the only parallel I can make, and it's not a very good parallel, would be like at the Super Bowl, or major sporting events where we have the American flag out there. It covers the whole field, and the Air Force flies over, or whatever, military flies over, and we have, but that's not the same, especially because it's not religious. It's more political. It's political religious.
Well, and it's an event. It's not like a daily thing.
That's true. Yeah. But European sporting events are starting to get a lot closer. Okay. So, and we did an episode with Sandra Glan about 7, 8, 9 months ago, and she went into a lot of this. We're going to go more systematically through 1 Timothy 2. So those of you that say, oh, 1 Timothy 2 says women can't be in ministry. Well, that's what today's episode is all about. Well, let's set the stage for that a little bit. So Ephesus was a major center of the Artemis cult. So let's go look at Acts chapter 19. I won't read the whole passage, but Paul is in Ephesus. And basically, he's putting the silversmiths out of business because so many people are coming to follow Christ that they can't make the idols. And Demetrius is all upset. And so they go into the theater. And basically, when they heard this, verse 28 says, they were filled with rage, began crying out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." The crowd was filled with confusion. They rushed with one accord in the theater, and they dragged Gaius and Aristarchus, who are two of the early Christian followers of Paul. You can tell both Greek by name. Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. Paul's like, hey, let me go in and speak to them. And like, yeah, that's not a good idea, Paul. So some of the crowd, verse 33, conclude that it was Alexander, since the Jews had put him forward, being in motion with his hand. Alexander was intending to make a defense to himself. Verse 34. Well, when they recognized that he was a Jew, A single outcry arose from them all as they shouted for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And so Paul and his companions decide, yeah, we're gonna get out of town right now. I think so. This type of cultic religious context is really, really critical to understanding what was going on. So Artemis, I think actually, I had it pulled up, but I don't have it any longer because I closed some tabs. I apologize. But if you go to images.google.com and you type in the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, you'll have, they're all reconstructions, of course, because the temple's been destroyed. But that temple gives you, it was like 4 times or 5 times bigger than the Parthenon in Athens. I mean, it was massive. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So,
I want to say it's bigger. It's basically the footprint is, I want to say, larger than a football field. I remember when I was studying it.
I think it's several football fields.
Well, I think I'm thinking something like it was 400 feet, where a football field is 300 feet, right? So I want to say in length it was like 400 by, I forget what it was width wise, but I mean this is like a significant facility for the ancient world, especially.
And one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. All right, here you go. Artemis. We'll cheat a little bit and we'll use Google search here. The Temple of Artemis was 300 just a little bit bigger than a football field, 377 feet long and 180 feet wide, about 18 meters high, 127 columns, about 60 feet high. Each were about 6 feet in diameter, mostly marble. It says twice as large here as the Parthenon in Athens. So a massive spectacle. So
which I think about in the ancient world, like in our modern world, we see large things often. This doesn't exist. Like you see this once in your lifetime if you're not from Ephesus, and this is going to be the biggest thing by far that you see. It's not like driving into San Francisco where you have skyscrapers everywhere.
Skyscrapers.
I mean, this
they didn't have the technology, I think, to build buildings that high. Obviously, they had technology to build pyramids in Egypt. That's another whole story. But
or was it aliens?
They were technologically deficient. What's that?
Was it aliens?
I know, I've seen them. They came and visited me last night.
I know. Anyways, that explains.
But we digress. The devotion to Artemis was intense in the city. So what Paul describes, or what Luke describes in Acts 19, is not far-fetched. Her temple employed thousands of priestesses. The worship was intertwined. We have to remember that religion and politics, they were not separate entities. This was all part of one thing there. So the worship of Artemis was part of civic identity. People came from around the world to visit Ephesus because of the Temple of Artemis. So you're getting economic prosperity. And it was also a female cult. And so because of that, women found status, security, and identity kind of with Artemis. Now, the story behind Artemis, and I know Sandra Glahn has done wonderful work on this, and we discussed that with her on our podcast. But just to review, in Greek mythology, Artemis is the twin sister of Apollo, or Apollos, and she's the firstborn. The dad is Zeus, and mom is Leto. And according to the story, there's different traditions, but Artemis was born first and basically came without pain, but she came like a walking, talking adult. They're gods, so of course they did. But her brother did not come for 9 days in some traditions. And mom was wreathing in pain the entire 9 days. And because Artemis saw that, she's like, okay, I am never going to have children. And she became very much female oriented against male. Look what the men did to her. And in the ancient world, a large number of women died in childbirth. It was not uncommon anyways. And so she became the protectress of women in childbirth. She was the one that they would call on for safety during labor. They dedicated garments to her after her childbirth. In other words, allegiance to Artemis was very critical for women, not only because of their status and identity in the city, because they had a lot of prominence in the city, but also because if I go to give birth, I might die, but Artemis will be my protectress and she'll save me. Okay, she was not a fertility goddess, and we discussed that with Sandra Glahn. So if you go to images.google.com and you type in the goddess Artemis, you'll see what look like many breasts. And you're the one that turned me on to this a number of years ago, Vinnie. We were talking about this before. That kind of sounded bad, by the way.
I was gonna.
Hey,
I'm
you
not
turned me
touching
on to
that
this.
one.
I
I'm
saw
not
your
touching
face.
that. I'm not
I
touching
saw
it.
your
Not touching
face.
it.
I'm like, oh,
Nope.
I guess that was my ADD transitioning from one thought to another
Uh-huh.
thought too
And then you catch it
quickly.
afterwards. Yep.
And I caught your face. So,
Nope.
anyways,
Nope.
you
Nope.
taught me about the Vinnie breasts, Vinnie, a long time ago, and that they're actually not breasts, not breasts.
You're actually turning red right now. You're
I
literally
need a
turning
drink of
red.
water.
As red as your shirt is, there's no delineation between Rob's
Ah.
shirt and his face.
Okay,
For our viewers
it's
at
the
home.
lighting. It's the lighting. I can
Oh, it's the
adjust. I can
lighting.
adjust that. Okay. Anyways,
But I mean,
so
there's reasons for this. I mean, just to interject on there, and this is where if you want to pick up Sandra Glon's book, it's fantastic. It's a read that's digestible by the layperson. But she'll even go through this where you
what
have
was
these
the name of her book again, Vinnie?
no is the name of the book. I forget the subtitle, but
Yeah, your
it's
sound cut out. Just so you know, I don't know if it cut out for everyone or if it's just for me. Say it again.
I think it's free.
No, nobody's mother. That's
Nobody's
right.
mother. But
Okay, thank you.
you look at certain things and first off, there's images that like Zeus, her dad has, and other male deities that also have these types of appendages. And so, okay, if this is on a male, it's obviously not associated with fertility.
Right.
None of these have nipples. And so if it's a fertility goddess, many breasts would say, okay, because she's producing offspring. Well, you need nipples in order to feed your child. So those aren't there. So they actually think it's probably more like what do they call it? A magic Hittite sack or something like that. There's these other explanations of what it probably is.
The beehives was the other one as well.
That was one of them. It's probably not a breast. And it's because there's nothing connecting.
Plural.
Breasts, there's nothing connecting Artemis in the ancient world with fertility. She's this midwife goddess who the reason why she is because so many women would die during childbirth and it was so painful. The prayer was artist here, and if I'm gonna die, take me out quick. And so she would actually assassinate the woman so she didn't have this prolonged death that happened for days and days. It would be merciful that they would kill the woman in childbirth. She would kill the woman early on so the woman didn't have to suffer. And that's why she's the goddess of midwifery. It's really it's a trip, her background there. We wouldn't see that as merciful, but that's in the ancient world when you have a high mortality rate in childbirth, that's a thing.
Yeah. All right, let's go look at the text. Oops, I lost the scripture. Let me go back.
You lost your scripture. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, because you brought up that other thing. Probably.
I did? Oh, I went.
Oh, you were going to do the image. Yeah. Anyway.
Okay. Anyways, I digress.
The joys of live television, folks. Here we go.
Are we on? Okay, very good. First Timothy chapter 2. I'm in Acts chapter 19 still. First Timothy chapter 2, verse 9. You want to read that, Vinny?
Yeah. I'm reading for NRSV. Is that what you have up there right now?
That's totally fine. I have ESV. I have New American. You want me to change it?
Yeah, it's fine. They get hear one and see the other. It's fine.
Okay.
Verse 9, which kind of starts mid phrase. Also, let's do the context so verse 8, I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or argument. Also, this is verse 9, that the women should dress themselves modestly and decently in suitable clothing, hair braided or with gold, pearls, or expensive clothes. Okay. Now, do you want me to move on or just 9?
No, we'll go back to the rest of the passages later. By the way, I found it interesting, your translation. Okay. So therefore, as the Greek is pretty emphatic. It's therefore. And I put in, I want the men and I want the women here in boxes. So you can see I want the men in verse 8. I want the women in verse 9. So that verses 9 through 15 is the passage that we're going to be discussing. But notice it kind of starts in verse 8. It's the therefore, although therefore is related to what's earlier. And then the contrast with the men and the women. But my translation says likewise, which is a much better translation of osatus than also, because it's I want the men to do this, and I also want the women to do this. So your translation was interesting. How's that?
Okay. Yeah. No, that is yeah.
So
So yeah, I mean, with this, I don't know. He does identify that there's this threefold thing: elaborate hairstyles, gold, pearls, or expensive clothes. Here, I want to start the conversation this way before I even ask a question. One thing I've noticed, and I don't have a camp in terms of how I interpret this passage. I've grown up. Cool. I've been in the complementarian world. I've kind of struggled with this concept where I could say I can't affirm complementarianism because I think there's too many questions that I see from an egalitarian side, an egalitarian reading. However, I don't think I'm not satisfied by egalitarian readings on things. One thing I have noticed, though, is in a complementarian world, when you're interpreting scripture, you oftentimes bring in background. It's very normal to want to look at historical context and all these things.
Yep.
This seems to be one of those passages that
Yep.
in a complementarian world, we want to ignore a lot of the background.
Or we've misread the background. Can I say it that way?
Well, yes, I would say we what I've seen is sometimes we will apply some of the background, but not all of the background.
Yeah, what I found was in
selective background.
In the conversation with Sandra Glahn, and then Nijay Gupta has a wonderful book that we'll refer to later on as well. And some of the other research that we've done, like, okay, what I have always taught was the background of this passage, even myself personally, is actually not correct.
An incorrect background, yes.
It's better to understand this in light of the Artemis cult. And when you understand it in light of the Artemis cult, it's like, oh, this makes perfect sense of what's going on with the text, the context, and the historical background. It comes out. And so I think that complementarians have misread the background. Doesn't mean that complementarianism is wrong. It just means that your background setting for what you think is going on here actually is not the case. So,
no, and I agree with that. And this is one of the sections where usually in a complementarian world, look at some of these things when it comes to hair. There's some other things that I'm trying to set up when we get there that they don't consistently look at the background.
Okay.
They don't even try to look at the background because anyway, we'll get to there when we get to there. But it is appropriate. You have to pay attention to the background here, just like we do in other areas of scripture. We do this all the time. We have to do it here. And I feel like that's one thing that I'm not satisfied from a complementarian reading. There's things that I think the complementarians are strong on, even in this passage that I haven't been able to work through. But we need to always make sure that we're paying attention to the context here in the background.
Yeah. All right. Very good. Let's talk about this passage here, and then we'll look at complementarian and egalitarian as we proceed.
At Determined Truth, we do more than just this podcast. One of our major projects is training pastors in India each week. We even help start a Bible college there. But we could only do this because of the generous support from partners like you. Seriously, that means you. If you consider supporting us with a fully tax-deductible donation with anything from $5 a month or more, we can continue to equip the church to be the church. To give, go to determinetruth.com and click on the Give tab, or find the link in today's show notes. Thanks.
And we're not doing a survey. We're just trying to figure out what the passage is saying. And so that's why if we're
I'm trying to present what I think the passage is saying. Yeah, and you might be trying to figure. Yeah, I think
I'm working it out here. I've been working
this passage for a long time, and we'll discuss that as we proceed. All right, here we go. So Michael Bird referred to the fact that it was indeed common for women to have outlandish displays of wealth and apparel and cosmetics. And the idea was that the popular idea that I had been raised with was, when Paul says don't wear elaborate hairstyles, gold, pearls, and expensive clothes, it's the wealthy lavishing it over the poor. And Paul's like, no, dress modestly in church. And that's a very common thing that you might even hear in churches today, that women should dress modestly when they go to church. And that comes from this particular text, and maybe others like it, but primarily this particular text. And what Bird noted was the fact was that dressing elaborately was actually specifically related to the Artemis cult. And he makes reference to the fact that there's a book called the Ephesiaca, which is written by a man named, I think, Xenophon, in Ephesus in the 1st century. And it actually describes in detail in this particular book what a procession to the temple of Artemis actually looked like. And here's a quote from Xenophon's book. It says, quote, "A local festival for Artemis was underway, and from the city to her shrine, a distance of 7 stades, all local girls had to march sumptuously adorned." And what it goes on to describe then actually is the dress and the clothing and the elaborate adornment that Paul seems to be referring to here is actually clothing characteristic of participation of priestesses and participants in the Artemis cult. So Paul's saying, Bird says, quote, Paul is saying, don't dress like one of the priestesses and participants in the Artemis cult. He's not making socioeconomic distinctions of rich and poor. Don't lavish it over the poor. Don't lavish your wealth in church. There's a place to wear your bling bling somewhere else, but church is not the place to do it. He's saying, no, we are not associating with the Artemis cult. In fact, we don't associate that way when we dress either. And again, I think it goes to what we said earlier.
Now, here's a question. I think and this is you have a PhD in biblical studies and hermeneutics. And so I'm actually questioning this as we look at interpretive principles. I think we oftentimes learn a background fact and say, this is the way it was
Yes.
in the New Testament time. So looking at like a manners and customs idea or something like that.
Yeah.
But what we probably need to recognize is that there's different cultural expressions. And so
Yes.
while something might, it sounds like I'm asking the right question. I'm working this out though. While something may be true of people in Rome or in Jerusalem or something like that in the first century, it doesn't mean that every region is going to have that same cultural practice. Like, am I on the right? And so we need to be careful in saying,
just think about it this way. Think of people in the southern part of the United States and the northern part of the United States and the western part of the United States. And we have technology, so we can talk to people, we can watch television shows, we can communicate on Zoom with people in those parts of the country instantaneously. So when you have people in Ephesus that have never seen anybody in Philippi before, maybe they might, well, Ephesus is like a central port city. So maybe they kind of come in and come out, maybe, but a peasant hasn't, or a peasant inland in Colossae has probably never seen people from other parts of the world. So whenever you have any type of geographical isolation, you're going to get distinctions, just even in accents, right? So people in Wales and people in London have radically different accents, even different languages. And so you start realizing, and they're not far apart, right? They're not as far apart as Alabama is from California.
Yep.
So you're definitely going to get different foods, different clothing, different cultural practices, different religious practices, idiosyncratic stuff. Absolutely, without question. And one of the things that's important to note here is we have got so many resources available to us now that we did not have 100 years ago, and the resources that were discovered 100 years ago are starting to get translated, starting to get worked. We are now full of resources available. We have a much better idea of what the ancient world was in this part of the world or in that part of the world than we did 100 years ago. So what we thought was the cultural background homogeneously throughout the Roman Empire, we now know actually that's not true here, or it's not true there, or it was unique there because of this religion. So we have a much better take on these things today.
So then a passage that might speak of a woman wearing braided hair or something like that, maybe to flaunt her sexuality or something like that, that could be a true statement of a woman century. It just doesn't mean that is what Paul is referring to for women in Ephesus when he's writing to Timothy. Is that what we should conclude?
And especially in light of the fact that we have this literal quote from Xenophon of, hey, this is what was going on in the procession, and we know how significant the Artemis cult was. And the Artemis cult makes so much sense as the background to this text that really seems to absolutely be what's going on here. And because Artemis cult was unique to Ephesus, then this would probably explain what's happening here, and it might not be the same thing as Paul might say in Corinthians.
Okay, and that's actually the example I was going to go to. So we need to just pause a quick second then and remind ourselves, right now we're engaging in a study talking about a pretty big thing, which is what can women do and what can they not do. And we want to make sure, like we do all over the place when we're doing biblical studies, I'm trying to think of a time, but we never have one passage rule and create like a strict doctrine. And
we never should have one passage
we never
rule.
should. And
we do.
I'm trying to think of how many other places do we have a significant
the millennium text, the rapture text.
Okay.
Certain hell text, maybe.
True.
Right.
True. Okay.
Giving in 1 Corinthians.
Okay.
But that's not as absolute there. There are certain texts that take precedence over everything else.
It's funny too, because all those texts that you mentioned become in many cases hobby horse texts, where the person will only focus on that. These texts define factions of the church, where it's an us versus them, and if you don't believe this, you're out. So it's interesting that many of those texts become just something that divide Christians when there's like one or two passages that speak on it. That's interesting.
The man of lawlessness of 2 Thessalonians 2 that we discussed a few weeks back. Absolutely. So what we're discussing here's we're going to do an episode next week in which we discuss, or maybe in a couple weeks, where we discuss a biblical theology of women in ministry. I'm going to present what I think is the case, Vinnie, and hopefully not to say this has to happen, by the way, but my goal would be to convince you, or to convince the listener or the viewer to say, hey, this is why I think egalitarianism is indeed the case. And again, in case we haven't said it here, I grew up complementarian. I went to a Baptist church. I went to a Baptist school for my graduate school, very much complementarian. Even Westminster Seminary, by the way, for my PhD program, women were not allowed in in the MDiv program because they couldn't be ordained in that denomination. And so I was raised in that kind of mindset and trained that way. So I've come a long ways, and for a long. But one of the things about it is, if I bring up this passage here, Galatians 3:28, neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female, we're all one in Christ Jesus. They'll say, yeah, but what about 1 Timothy 2? And if I say, oh, well, 1 Corinthians 11 actually is, Paul saying women can pray and prophesy in church, yeah, but what about 1 Timothy 2? This becomes the unless you convince me about 1 Timothy 2, I'm not listening to you on all the other passages.
Yes.
And so what we'll do next week is we'll say, just look at women in the New Testament alone. We don't have time for the Old Testament included. But in the New Testament, how prominent they are. Philip's 4 daughters are prophetesses. You have Junia, who disputable. In Romans 16, appears to be an apostle. You have Phoebe, who's reading the book of Romans. My mind's going. I have to keep giving examples. But Aquila and Priscilla's name occurs before his most often, and she's teaching Apollos, who apparently was the pastor or became the pastor in Colossae. You're looking at women having extremely prominent roles, let alone in the gospel stories. Mary is a disciple of Jesus, women are the first eyewitnesses of the resurrection, and on and on and on. And the answer becomes, well, that's all fine and dandy, but 1 Timothy 2 says, it lays down the law. Women can't be pastors in churches. So what we want to do today is look at that passage as much time as we have in some detail and explain what I think the text is really saying in light of the Artemis cult. And then next week we'll say, now let's look at the biblical theology of the New Testament at least. I'll give a biblical theology of the whole thing. And if we have time next week, we'll look at Genesis 3. But God says that the woman's going to desire her husband and the man's going to rule over her. That's the way God established it. And say, well, that's not a correct interpretation either, but the new creation's certainly come about since then as well. All right. I know we're running a little short on time as we move forward. So let's continue.
Yeah. So do we want to go through the text a little bit, or what do we want to do?
Yeah, let's go ahead and go through 1 Timothy 2, and let me bring the text back up. I think I lost it again. I don't know why I lost it.
You did a lot.
We're going to read verses 9 through 15. Go ahead. You want to read verses? Sure. We kind of read verse 9, but go ahead and read verses 10 through 15 then.
Yeah. So it just talked about all the stuff that they shouldn't be doing. They should be modest. But verse 10, so actually it kind of connects. Don't dress yourself with, all these bad things. Dress yourself modestly, but dress yourself with good works, as is proper for women who profess reverence for God. Now here's where it gets tricky. This is why a lot of people don't like Paul.
Yeah.
Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. So, man, there is seriously, this could be like a multi-part study right here, because there's so much in this passage where could we say this is on the Mount Rushmore of difficult passages to understand in the entire Bible?
Well, I would have said that. I think it's actually easier now that Sandra Glan's opened our eyes up to so many things. Yeah.
Okay.
It's not easy, but I think 2 Thessalonians 2 is more difficult.
Okay.
But sure, I understand why you would say that. I totally understand.
Well, and part of it is for me, and we'll get there, I'm sure, but what is a term, and we don't see it in English, but what does it mean for a man to not have authority, or what does it mean for a woman to not have authority? To not have authority. Well, that word authority in English is just authority. What do you do when it's the only time this Greek word appears in the Bible? And so what does it mean? And so it's really things like that. Exactly. So,
okay. So
anyway,
I did
where do we want to go?
Let me see if I got the right searches. Here we go. All right. So I did a search. Here, let's look at I'll bring the English back up. So over here on the left-hand side, athetain is the word for, and you can see how it's highlighted in yellow, and exercise authority over is how it's translated in the New American Standard. So athetain. Now, I did a search on that word, and notice here we go. And this is the only place in the entire New Testament it's used. Now, it's the word for authority, exercise authority. But here's the common word for authority, exousia, and here's all of its occurrences in the New Testament.
And that's Paul's normal. I don't even know how many times Paul used it, but that's going to be Paul's word for it.
Yeah, we can. Here we go. Romans 9, Romans 13,
Mm-hmm,
Romans
mm-hmm,
13, Romans 1 Corinthians 7, or
mm-hmm.
8, 9, 9, 9, 9, 9, 11. Sounds like I'm on Nazi. 9, 9, 9. Oh, sorry. Second Corinthians. I digress. 2 Corinthians 10, Ephesians 1, Ephesians 2, Ephesians. Yeah, look at all these examples and notice it's used in Titus. So if we're going to group the pastorals together, he knows this word. Hebrews, Revelation. So.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the extant Greek literature, and what we mean when we say that is that this word, I'm just going to flip over here, and I know why it's going away, that the Greek word exousia is used 1,500 times in all ancient Greek Koine literature. In other words, not just in the biblical text, but any ancient Greek writing that we have out there. That's the common word for authority. So the question becomes, if Paul is saying, hey, women can't have authority over a man, and that's just a blanket, and it makes sense when you look at it in English.
You're saying, wait, you're saying exousia was used 15?
Exousia was used 1,500 times.
Okay.
is only used once, and it's here. So it makes sense.
But hang on, because it could be confusing for the listener. So the word that Paul normally uses for authority, exousia, that's the word that's used. That's the common word that's used not only in the Bible, but outside of the Bible for authority.
And it's not the only word that is available. There are other words also, but that's the most common by far. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
But authenteo, the word that he uses in 1 Timothy 2:9, this is the only time it appears in the New Testament. And I don't know if you were going to talk about like other uses outside of the New Testament, which is kind of rare as well.
Yeah. Well, so we'll get to that in just a second. Well, what does the word mean? But let me point out the first point here. And this is from Nijay Gupta and his book, Tell Her Story, a wonderful book on women in the church and women in the New Testament, by the way. Really accessible. I think
absolutely.
Very, yeah. Okay. He says this, quote, why would Paul opt for an exceptionally rare word for such an important statement if there were other similar terms that were far more familiar and commonplace? He would have no reason to do that unless he had a special nuance or connotation that necessitated its usage. Rare circumstances lead to more specialized terminology. So the first point is the very fact that he's using a very obscure word suggests that he has a particular issue in mind and not a general statement about women having authority over men in all cases.
Okay. So how do you understand it, or how do we find a meaning then for like should we just assume that he's using it synonymously with exousia, or what do we do with this word? Because that's the way it's translated. It's usually translated in the same exact way as exousia.
Well, again, the cultural historical context and Ephesus is really going to be important to figure this out as well. But Nijay Gupta references Cynthia Long Westfall, who has done a thorough search of authenteo in the ancient
She's like the
literature.
authority on this word.
Exactly. And she describes the word authenteo as having a range of meaning that's basically, it connotes violence, but not necessarily murder or violence. But the idea is that the people who are the targets of these actions, the targets of your authority, it's a strong, negative, nasty word in a sense. The people who are targets of that word are harmed or forced against their will, or at least their self-interest is, quote, overridden because the actions involve the imposition of the subject's will over against the recipient's will, ranging from dishonor to lethal force. And then he says, quote, this is from Nijay Gupta, quote, it is a mistake, she goes on to say, that's Westfall, to pretend that this is a positive verb regarding the exercise of authority, such that it might refer to a servant leadership or pastoral care. It's about overpowering someone or something else for one's own advantage or gain. Westfall supports her case by noting that Paul does not go on to say, oh, rather men should authenteo over a woman. He doesn't, if women can have authority over men, why doesn't he say, but men can have authority over women? Because that's not what's happening here. And I think that's a really, really good argument.
So with this, you used positive and negative. So if I'm understanding this, what you're saying here, authority in and of itself isn't bad. And so someone could have authority and they lead and they have authority in a positive way. And think of that principal you had in school, or maybe your boss, you have that person who has that authority figure and they're doing it appropriately. They're doing it well, the way it should be, the way it ought to be. That would be a positive use of authority.
Right.
What this is and exousia can be used in that way, depending on the context. It just carries the connotation of authority, and then how you describe it could either make it positive or negative. We could say
that's right.
this authenteo has no positive meaning. Authenteo is just a negative term in terms of you can't redeem authenteo. Is that what we mean?
It implies a violent overriding of the other person's will, maybe even doing harm to the other person. But look at the context. And again, the context is everything here. So he begins the whole passage, which we'll come back to later on as well, that he says, hey guys, I want you to make prayers on behalf of those in authority, that you can lead a quiet life in all godliness and dignity. This is good. And he goes on to say, oh, by the way, I want, as a result, and the word therefore means, in light of what I just said, here is my conclusion. Therefore, I want men to pray this way, and notice what it says, without wrath and dissension. The men were not praying in a healthy way. There was problems. Likewise, I want women to dress this way, meaning what they were doing was a problematic. And he goes on to say, and a woman must learn quietly. And there's that word quietly. It's the noun form of the same word that was there earlier. And she cannot exercise authority over a man, but she's to be quiet. And the whole context suggests that what's going on here is something negative and something inappropriate.
So here's my question, though. It would be inappropriate for a man to have authenteo over a woman or a man as well. So why is this? And this is where stuff that as I'm putting all the puzzle pieces out there and I have no skin in the game, for the first time in my life, I could actually explore this subject.
Okay, cool.
I have to tie it to a
page. Yeah, because your job's not on the line.
My job's not on the line, right?
Yeah, true.
And so I could just do it in a way where it's like, okay, I could actually do this now. It is scary because and this is a sidebar. I actually texted Summer and a few other friends the other day saying, this is scary studying this because I have no clue where I'm going to come down on this, but if I come down on a certain side of the equation, that makes me unemployable in so many ministry contexts.
Oh, so there's still skin in the game.
Well, it's not that, it's just the recognition of it. It's saying like this cuts me out of a lot of places, even just serving in a church that I might join one day, where they might not want me if there's some churches that hold to this they make this almost like the gospel. And so it's one of those things where I know what's out there, but I'm always going to go with what the text says, right? That's the thing that's always going to push me. So here's my question though. The complementarian side of me says, this is, of course no one should have a negative authority. So why wouldn't Paul demand this of the men as well?
Because they weren't doing
Why is this just something? But
the women were doing it. But the women were doing, the men were having dissension amongst the men. So Paul's like, hey, when you pray, lift up holy hand without dissension and wrath. The women were having dissension over the men. Hey, women, stop doing that. He's not going to address the men not doing it because they weren't doing it. I mean, that's the simple answer. Can I prove that was the case? No, but
that's what I was going to say though.
Complete sense.
Like, and this is where I'll push back, just because you have to push back in these. It's an argument from silence. Show me that the women are doing these things.
That would be the cultural context of the Artemis cult, where women had superiority, and it was a very much of a feministic world cultural context where the women dominate. So remember, Artemis is one of the Amazonian women, right? I mean, that's the whole idea behind that. The superiority of women, and they were flaunting this, and apparently that answer is that's why Paul's addressing. That was the reason why we say that the women were doing that is because Paul uses this unique word that suggests that the women were doing this. If they were just having authority over a man, he would have used exousia. So it makes the most sense of the text. To say that Paul's forbidding women having authority over a man as a general rule, well, that doesn't make sense why he's using a rare word that has a negative connotation that fits the cultural context.
So let's back it up a little bit to verse 11 then. Let a woman learn in silence with submission. Like, is this something where do we just read this literally? I mean, I've tried to invoke this so many times in church context, and it never works. But no, does silence mean silence? Does full submission? We're taught to submit to. Women are taught to submit to their husbands. So who are they submitting to in this regard?
Well, let me see what I think your translation says. Does your translation say silent here in verse 11?
It says, let a woman learn in silence with full submission.
Oh, that's okay. So here's the deal. This is why
which is interesting because this is NRSV, and normally it smooths those things out.
All right, so up here in verse 2 is the adjective, and I highlighted it in orange, so it'll come up in orange in the English over on this side, and you can see it's an adjective, and it means quiet. Okay, and the idea is peaceful. So I want you to pray for those in authority, so that you can lead a peaceful life. Okay. So then down here, when he uses the same word, although it's a noun form, it's the same root. And you can see it's exousia. All right. Yeah, I'm really good at pronouncing words sometimes. All right. That it's not silent. It's peaceful, quietness. And so my translation went with quietly, which is adverbial, even though it's actually a noun here. So a woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. I don't allow her to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to be peaceful. And that further suggests that the context of authenteo is violent usurping of power and authority over the man. So he's not telling her to shut up at all. He's telling her that she has to be at peace within the context of the church. And it goes back again that, look at the men were, I'll just reiterate, the whole passage is talking about, look, we are to do this to keep peace within the community of God's people. First off, we pray for kings and those in authority that we can have a peaceful, quiet life. And then in the church, I want men to pray without wrath and dissension. And women, you can't come in like the priestesses of the Artemis cult. And you can't come in trying to usurp authority over the men in a negative way. But instead, let's learn and be in a peaceful, submissive context or state of stature. How's that?
Okay,
Yep.
so let me push back again from my complementarian background, okay? Because I'm familiar with the arguments on the text here.
Yeah.
If we're looking at the Greek here, I then look to verse 13. Obviously, Paul didn't write with versification. So he says for. So there's this conjunction here that's in Greek. He's using gar. It's an explanatory conjunction. For this reason, because this is the reason why they need to keep silent. Adam was formed first and then Eve. So he's appealing to creation, and he's saying that there's a hierarchy almost in terms of like I'm reading this as a firstborn, order of importance. And then it's saying, hey, Adam wasn't deceived, the woman was, which is then brings another question to me. Well, that's not what Paul appeals to in Romans 6. He's blaming
Romans 5. Yeah.
So Romans 5. So what's up with that? So there's that issue to work through. But if I were to put on my complementarian hat, I'm just using the grammatical argument here to say, well, Paul doesn't seem to go on to make the argument that it's a context thing. He roots it in creation.
Exactly. And that's the very common argument that I held to for a long, long time. And it makes a lot of sense. All right. The word for, of course, it's a conjunction that connects things. And it often means the reason why, but it doesn't always mean the reason why. It's a connective conjunction, right? And simple as saying, hey, look, now, Adam was made first. Certainly, this is referencing the creation account, and verse 14 is the creation account as well. But here's what I think is actually important. Let me come back to this. Here we go. Very good. I'll pull this down for a second. And that is what Paul's saying is, remember in the Artemis cult, Artemis was made first, and her brother Apollo came second. And Paul's like, sorry, women aren't first. Adam was made first. He's not saying the reason why women can't do this is because the man was made first. He's like, no, the woman can't do this because the whole idea of grounding of your claim is that she can exercise authority in a hostile way over the men is because Artemis was first. And he's like, no, Adam was first. So that makes
right
a lot
there,
more sense to me.
So even with that, though,
and
I'm not denying the background, but it does lend itself to a headship type, affirming a more, I don't want to say conservative, but a complementarian headship type view. Because this is something we should say as well. This is not an issue of conservative versus liberal theologically, which oftentimes it's put that way. It's oftentimes put as the conservatives hold to complementarianism, and it's the liberals who are egalitarian. And theologically, there's plenty of conservatives who are egalitarian. I mean, the whole Assemblies of movement is full of conservatives, theologically conservatives who would affirm females in leadership. There's many denominations, so it has nothing to do with conservative versus liberal. But the complementarian world would say, hey, this is affirming what we read in other areas. So I know, help me out there if it's
okay.
Because it seems like it's really resting a lot on the Artemis thing, and the Artemis linchpin has to hold true for this entire thing to be true.
And this is one of the things that happens in conversations. It's a very important exercise for both of us and for those who are listening and watching. And that is, let's deal with this text here,
Okay.
and then we'll go to the next text.
Okay.
But you can't go that because the next text says this, therefore this text here says this also.
Mm-hmm.
No, we got to deal with 1 Timothy 2. Now, I'm not denying that we read Scripture in light of Scripture. That's great. But the interpretation of 1 Timothy 2 is dependent upon 1 Timothy and its context first and foremost. And is 1 Timothy asserting male headship? And the answer is no. Paul's simply responding to the fact that the idea that Artemis was first is not true. Adam was first. Mm-hmm. Oh, and by the way, the idea that women should exercise authority is like, wait a second. Eve shares in some of the blame of the problem because she's also the one that let sin into the world. So it's not asserting. I totally makes sense that we read this not a male headship, but the answer is no, that's not what's happening here. Now, is that what's happening somewhere else? Okay, let's establish this one first, and then we'll go look at that passage next. So just to reiterate here, I know we have to finish up here in a few minutes.
Yeah.
Would be number one, I'd simply say the context of 1 Timothy 2 is that women were usurping authority and trying to dominate over men. And Paul is addressing the bad practices of that and simply saying, no, that cannot happen. We are to do things peaceably within the community of God's people. The idea that he's saying, well, Eve sinned first, therefore, women can't have authority over men. He's like, no, he's just simply saying that Eve shares in the blame of the sin because, again, the Artemis cult. The third, of course, which we'll deal with next week, is Genesis 3:16. Oh, that Adam's going to rule over the woman and the woman's going to desire her husband. That is totally misused. That it has to do with the conflict within Adam and Eve and within the creation narrative. And the idea is that instead of ruling as one, as a unity, remember they were naked and not ashamed in Genesis 2. They were ruling as one. Now they rule in conflict with one another because they're not ruling with God as the authority, but with self as the authority. And the male says, I want to rule. And the woman says, I want to rule. And they're going to rule in conflict. So the word for desire, which we'll look at next week, for Eve, you're going to desire your husband. It's a desire to dominate him, but he's going to dominate you because that's what happens when you have more power. The male tends to have more power than the woman. Now,
so this becomes Well, I was just going to say this becomes a question that we all need to ponder, and this would be good from this week to next week. How, when you sit back, listener, and you view, when you inventory on this is how I view this topic of men and women, and I didn't think about this for years. Is your view of man and woman, especially parents, is it a result of the fall, or is it rooted in creation? And I never even thought about that question. Is this the way it's supposed to be, or is this because something happened? And that's something that we need to explore.
And we'll look at that next week. And not only that was, I would add, which I'll discuss next week, and we discussed this a while earlier, just it's good to reiterate things, that if it's rooted in creation with the equality of male and female, made in the image of God, and the new creation is begun in Christ, then that tells us what the New Testament answer should be. Or it gives us a platform, a foundation for, hey, these are the lens that we look at through the New Testament as well. A last point, and that's this, maybe not the last point, but we'll see. If women were prone to deception, if that's what Paul's getting at, hey, she's the one that ate the fruit, she's the one that did it, and that's why she can't teach or have authority over a man, then why are we letting them teach or have authority over women and children?
I was actually going to ask that question as well.
Yeah, it's like the whole idea that that's what Paul's saying here actually contradicts the idea that, well, therefore she can't teach over men, but it's okay to go ahead and let the women deceive other women. Like, let
them deceive, Let
them deceive the kids. We'll correct the kids when they get older. Like, when they fall under the authority of them, it's like, seriously, come on, not at all. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, and it just becomes arbitrary as well. Like, well, who are the kids? At what point are you not a kid anymore? And is it cultural? Or is it biblical as well? All right, I'm going to come in. I'm going to bring in more questions as well next time, Rob, because you have to scratch my complementarian itch on figuring some of these things out.
I'm happy to do so. I think this is a great conversation, and we'll hope we might finish it in the next episode. Or we might even add a third episode, because I think there's a really important issue of gender discrimination and gender injustice that we have a responsibility to address. And I want to make sure we either get that in the next episode, or we'll add a third episode to this discussion as well. So, hey, really quickly, let's look at 1 Timothy 2:15. I know we got to go. I have to go. But 1 Timothy 2:15, let me bring it up.
You're going to leave us with this one really quickly?
Yeah. Well, we addressed it with Sandra Glahn on that episode as well, so we can refer back to that as well. But it says, women will be preserved through childbearing or the bearing of children if they continue in faith, love, and sanctity with self-restraint. And what Sandra Glenn did a phenomenal job of explaining for us was the idea that what's happening here, let me get rid of that, there you go, is that Artemis and allegiance to Artemis was critical for women because she's going to protect me through childbirth. If I give faith to Jesus and I let go of Artemis, what happens when I go to give birth? And Paul's answer is, Jesus will protect you through childbirth. All you have to do is remain faithful to him. So when he says that you'll be preserved through childbearing, if you continue in faith and love, it's Christ is going to be your protectorate, not Artemis. I think that's what's going on there. Yep.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, hey, my friends, hopefully you enjoyed this conversation. We're enjoying it. And I would encourage you, wherever you land on this discussion, and it's not an either or, there's a spectrum. If you're a complementarian listening to this, please have the same charity for the other side that you would if you're a Baptist and you have a friend who's a Presbyterian that I know that you probably give charity to over something like
that's a hard ask, Vinnie.
Well, it's interesting because there's been a movement in the last 20 years amongst especially more of the Reformed crew, the Reformed crowd, where there's all these conferences, there's all these organizations that are put together. They have Together for the Gospel and the Gospel Coalition. And what it means is we're all Reformed and we'll totally do conferences together. We'll do this and we could have completely different views of baptism. We could show charity when it comes to ecclesiology, and that's fine. But then this is the issue that determines, they're not even a real church if they have women pastors or whatever.
And sometimes it's politics too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely it is.
But
if you're on the complementarian side, you need to have the same kind of charity you would give in those other, what we would call non-essentials, because this is, it is essential, but it's not, this isn't denying the Trinity or something. It's a secondary issue in that regard.
But going back to last week's conversation, this is a really important conversation.
Absolutely.
Look at what it's done to Summer. Look what it's done to the women that we've had on the podcast. Look what it's done to women in our churches. Look what it's done in our society. This is a really important conversation. Now,
completely agree.
If I can add a thing too here, and that is, if you listen and go, well, I'm not convinced that the Bible is egalitarian. Well, we didn't provide any evidence for egalitarian. What we simply said was this passage is not teaching complementarianism in the sense that it's not teaching that the women can't have authority over men, i.e. she can't be a pastor. It's saying, no, she can't usurp authority in a negative, nasty way if she's the prominent feature. After all, Artemis wasn't made first, Adam was, that's all he's taught. So what we did is we dismantled, I dismantled, or I took away some of the textual support for the key text in the New Testament that supports male headship, at least within the leadership of the church.
Yeah. Well, and then I would also challenge
signing off because that was
I'm going to keep talking. I would also encourage my egalitarian friends. Yeah, please walk off screen. That I know so many folks. Wonderful. I know so many folks who are egalitarian just because a complementarian reading of the text is narrow-minded and shallow and misogynistic, and they just, it's basically, I don't like it. All complementarians are misogynistic pigs and all that. And I think there are a lot of them. I've met them. But the thing is, don't discount the complementarian just because they hold that view, because I think a lot of them are just trying to, the ones who I respect, they're just trying to adhere to scripture. And so we can't make this a divide on either side unless it's outright misogyny from the complementarian side, or just an outright bigotry from the left, or wokeism, because that's a long word. But it's like when it just becomes those things, okay, let's not take it seriously. But people are trying to understand the text properly. Let's give charity there and actually give the same charity we do in other instances. Why can't we do that on this one?
Now, if you talk with them for like an hour, they listen to this podcast and they still haven't changed their mind, then
in hours what we get.
Then because if this hasn't convinced them, then nothing else will.
Right. I mean, we're so infallible and so good.
Yeah. I mean, couldn't have done it better. We could have totally done this one better, but that's all right.
There you go. All right, everyone. All right. We'll stop for now because then something else crazy might happen. And Rob's already been super offensive today, making basically that's what she said jokes for me.
I did not do that. You're going to cut that out of the podcast, by the way.
Well, you made the type of joke, not the joke.
Okay.
You did it earlier. Anyway, you know what we're also going to do right now? I just forgot about this. In honor of women, I have a video that we're going to insert right now that you're gonna of Rob showing his affirmation of women that we're going to insert right now. And we're going to play that off.
I did not approve of this.
You do you know what it is?
No, but I gotta go.
Let's just say
later.
Visited Jordan recently, and Jordan sent me a video.
Oh, dude, is you seriously? I know exactly what it is. Oh,
Jordan said, do with this as you wish, or something.
Oh, are you serious? That is my second born son, and he is now in my third born. He's been demoted. And he might even go down to fourth. Mackenzie just got elevated above him too.
Mackenzie is more of a favorite son than Jordan is.
Yes. Favorite child.
Because you're egalitarian.
He's got the grandson though. I mean, all right. Anyways.
It's true. Anyway,
all right.
That's happening now. See you guys next week. And cue Rob.
You want thingamabobs? I've got plenty.
But who cares?
But who cares?
No big deal.
No big deal.
We need some goodies.
Want more.
No, listen to me instead.
Whose red hair you like better, mine or Ollie's?
Yeah, which one?
Hold on. Is that right here?
Thanks for joining us today. If you dug it, please subscribe and share it with others. Check us out at Determinetruth.com to see more of what we do and maybe even consider supporting us. See you next time.
Faith is an ocean.